Something I hear a lot of these days, especially when it comes to CPU benchmarking, is that CPU performance doesn't matter when gaming at 4K. You're always going to end up being GPU limited, even with a reasonably low-end CPU. So there's no point buying a fast gaming CPU that's proven to deliver strong performance at low resolutions if you're gaming at 4K. Now, there are certainly examples you can point to as evidence of this, and in fact, most CPU benchmarks that include 4K data do just that. But that data can be very misleading, significantly more so than low resolution testing, and in this video, I'm going to explain why. But before I do,
today's video is sponsored by MSI. Thinking of upgrading your monitor? Now is the perfect time, thanks to MSI's stunning new QD OLED gaming monitors. With 4K 240Hz and 1440p 360Hz options, there's something for everyone, whether that's fast-paced competitive gaming on the elite speed of OLED, brilliant HDR gaming on these bright, immersive, well-calibrated displays, or even creator work backed by a 3-year OLED warranty. There's tons of connectivity too, including KVM support. I've been very impressed with the performance of these MSI QD OLEDs, and I strongly recommend them as flagship gaming monitors that will satisfy your needs for years to come. Find out more on MSI's new range of QD OLED gaming monitors via the links in the description.
Okay, so let's first talk about CPU reviews that include 4K data. Typically, CPU reviews will use the most powerful GPU available, so RTX 4090, as it helps to remove the GPU bottleneck, better isolating the CPU in order to evaluate its gaming performance. Now, what might seem counterintuitive is the use of higher ultra-quality presets, but it's often the higher quality presets that stress the CPU the most. Settings such as animations, level of detail, draw distance, and crowd density can be very CPU intensive. So when you take a GPU like the RTX 4090 and test at 4K using ultra-quality settings, the resulting data can be misleading, depending on your preferences. And by preferences, I mostly mean your desired frame rate. First and foremost, the game has to play at a frame rate that you deem acceptable, and that's hopefully anything from 60 FPS to high refresh rate stuff like 120 FPS or more. And take this Starfield data for example. At 4K using the ultra quality preset, the RTX 4090 and 7800X3D combo saw an average frame rate of 76 FPS. But if you're really after 90 FPS or more, then you might lower the quality settings to medium or more likely enable upscaling. But the point is you'll make the necessary adjustments to quality settings in order to achieve your desired frame rate. In this example, we can see that the 7800X3D is able to push over 100 FPS in this title, and it actually caps out at 130 FPS. But you're only going to learn that information through lower resolution testing. Now, the problem is, if we included 4K results using the Ultra preset, which we would, as you're not going to test 10 plus CPUs at multiple resolutions using multiple quality presets. But in that case, that means 76 FPS would be the cap, as that's all the RTX 4090 is good for here. Therefore, if all CPUs tested can allow the RTX 4090 to render 76 FPS, then it gives the viewer the impression that at 4K, CPU performance doesn't matter, as frame rates there are the same when comparing the 7800X3D and maybe something like a 5800X, for example. But in reality, the 5800X might cap out at 80 FPS, and if you're willing to adjust a few quality settings in the hope of hitting 90 FPS or more, that is not going to be possible with that older Ryzen 7 part. This also becomes an issue if you ever upgrade your GPU, which I assume at some point you're going to do, because when you do, you are going to more easily find the limits of your CPU at higher resolutions. Anyway, I've spent about a week at the test benches recording a heap of data on half a dozen games using the Ryzen 5 3600 and Ryzen 7 7800X3D, along with the Radeon RX 7700 XT, 7900 XT, and RTX 4090. Now, please try not to fixate on the CPUs used for this testing. The purpose was to use two very different processors as it more clearly demonstrates what we're talking about here, and the CPUs themselves are not really that important. Really, it's the frame rates that we want to look at. Anyway, it's super interesting stuff that explains this topic really well in my opinion, so let's get into it. We'll start with the Hogwarts Legacy data at 1080p using the 7700 XT, which is a fairly low-end GPU by today's standards. Sure, it does cost $400 US right now, but the RTX 4060 is $300. Anyway, at the more typical 1080p resolution used for testing CPUs, we see that the 7800X3D is much faster than the 3600, even when using the Ultra preset. In this example, we're going from 73 FPS to 98 FPS, so a 34% increase. But if we were to test with the medium quality settings, we see that margin blow out to 74% and then 83% with low, as the Ryzen 5 processor appears to max out at just over 80 FPS. So this data clearly indicates that if you're okay with around 80 FPS on average, the 3600 is fine, but if you want more than that, you'll have to look at an upgrade. And this is why 4K CPU benchmarking is, dare I say it, a bit dumb, because you really learn everything you need to with this 1080p data. If you want 60 FPS at 4K, you'll adjust the settings accordingly for your GPU to enable that level of performance, and you know that the 3600 can deliver that performance. But if you want 90 FPS or more, it doesn't matter what the resolution is, the 3060 simply cannot achieve that level of performance. Jumping up to 1440p still sees the Ryzen 5 3600 capped at 84 FPS, with the same performance seen using the medium and ultra presets. The 7800X3D is slower at 1440p, as we're becoming more bound by the Radeon GPU, but even so, it's possible to push past 100 FPS using the medium or low presets. Now at the 4K resolution, we're learning very little about CPU performance, as we are mostly looking at the limitations of the 7700 XT, which is only good for around 67 to 68 FPS using the low preset. There are some noteworthy differences seen to 1% lows, as the 7800 X3D is much faster than 3600, but if you focus on the average frame rates, it's really easy to conclude that CPU performance doesn't matter at 4K, especially when you don't own an RTX 4090. And this is true enough if you're happy with 60 FPS gaming, but for those of you who demand more, you'll either be forced to lower the resolution or more likely enable upscaling. And either option will see the 3600 cap performance to around 80 FPS, whereas the 7800 X3D can go much faster, and let's look at that now with the 7900 XT. Upgrading to the 7900 XT doesn't do much for the Ryzen 5 processor, as you'd expect given that the 7700 XT data was already entirely CPU limited, even at 1080p. We're seeing just a few extra frames with the low and medium presets, but other than that the results are all much the same. The 7800 X3D on the other hand sees a 36% performance increase with the Ultra preset, then 10% for medium and 12% for low. So those lower quality presets are starting to find the throughput limits of the X3D chip. But something to point out is that previously when using the 7700 XT, the 7800 X3D was just 34% faster than the 3600, with the ultra quality settings at 1080p. Here, it's 82% faster, so a significant difference there. Jumping up to 1440p doesn't change many of the results. The low preset with ray tracing enabled is now heavily GPU limited, and we see the margin using the Ultra preset reduced to 61% in favour of the 7800 X3D, but other than that, the margins are all very similar. Now at 4K, we see when using the 7900 XT that the Ryzen 5 3600 is limited to the same sub 90 FPS performance that we saw at 1080p using the 7700 XT. We also see when using the ultra quality settings that the average frame rate performance is nearly identical between the 7800 X3D and 3600, as both are limited by the GPU to around 70 FPS. Now, with the RTX 4090 installed, the Ryzen 5 3600 is actually slightly slower at 1080p when compared to what we saw with the 7700 XT, and this is a result of Nvidia's overhead issue, which I've explored in past content, and I'll link to those videos in the description for those of you who are interested. This effect is most noticeable using the 7800 X3D with the low quality preset, as it was actually 15% faster when using the 7700 XT. But we're not here to explore Nvidia's overhead issue, so let's ignore that for this testing. What we do see is an 85% performance increase for the 7800 X3D over the 3600 when comparing the ultra quality data at 1080p, and this looks to roughly be the true performance difference between these two CPUs. The margin is bigger with the low preset using ray tracing, 94% there, but that data is included more for science, as I doubt anyone would use that combination of quality settings. The point is though, just as we found with the 7700 XT at 1080p, the Ryzen processor is limited to around 80 FPS. It cannot push higher frame rates than that. So as we jump up to 1440p, it's no surprise to find that the 3600 is limited to 78 FPS or 65 FPS when using the Ultra preset. We also find the same results for the 7800X3D, as the data is still largely CPU limited here. Then at 4K, we see that the 7800X3D using the low and medium settings is still CPU limited, and although it is possible to achieve higher frame rates with the 7900XT, the overheat issue means the GeForce GPUs limit performance to around 130 FPS. The 7800X3D is still 41% faster than the 3600 at 4K when using the ultra quality settings, but as I said earlier, don't focus too much on the CPUs used. In this example, we know that the 7800X3D can drive 120 FPS using the ultra settings, seen at 1080p, so with the right quality settings or GPU, this can also be achieved at 4K, assuming that the CPU can deliver that level of performance. Another new game that we can look at is Starfield, and in this example, the Ryzen 5 3600 can't render more than 60 FPS, though if we were to compare it with the 7800X3D at 1080p using the ultra quality preset, but with the 7700XT, we'd conclude that both CPUs deliver similar performance. Of course, if we lower the quality settings, which results in less GPU-bound data, we see that the 7800X3D is up to 69% faster using the low settings. Again, we don't need 4K data to tell us how the 3600 performs at 4K, and in fact, we don't even need a faster GPU. It's really all about the frame rates, and if you are happy with 60 FPS gaming, then the 3600 can deliver that. But if you want 90 FPS or more, the 3600 will need to be upgraded. Now, if we increase the resolution to 1440p, we find that the ultra and higher results are heavily GPU limited. But again, we're looking at sub 60 FPS performance. But if you were to use the high or ultra settings with the 7700XT, you'd conclude that CPU performance doesn't matter. Then at 4K, we see that CPU performance for this data doesn't matter, regardless of the settings used. The 3600 is able to match the 7800X3D, and this is what a lot of the 4K review data looks like, as most of these examples are heavily GPU limited to less than 60 FPS. So if you're gaming at 4K with a 7700XT, you're likely to be lowering the quality settings and probably even enabling upscaling, so at that point technically you're not really gaming at 4K. But let's now turn up GPU performance with the 7900XT. As expected, this does nothing for the Ryzen 5 3600, as the data is still heavily CPU limited to around 60 FPS. The 7800X3D, on the other hand, sees a 53% performance increase when using the ultra settings, averaging 92 FPS. But we also see that it's good for up to 131 FPS when using the low preset. Increasing the resolution to 1440p does nothing for the 3600. It's still capped at 60 FPS, but the 7800X3D is 27% faster when using the Ultra preset, and up to 92% faster when using the low quality settings. Then at 4K, much of the data is GPU limited to 60 FPS or less, though the 7800X3D is now up to 20% faster when using the low quality settings. For those unhappy with 60 FPS, this is another example where you'd probably drop the quality settings to high or even medium, and then enable upscaling, pushing performance more towards what was seen at 1440p. Now, Nvidia's overhead issue isn't present in Starfield, so we're not seeing a decline in performance for the RTX 4090 at 1080p. Rather, this data shows us just how much faster the 7800X3D is, delivering more than twice the performance of the 3600. Even at 1440p, the results are very similar for the most part, and we see when using the Ultra preset that the 7800X3D was 84% faster, then 98% faster using high, and 118% faster with the medium settings. Finally, at 4K, we see that the Ryzen 5 3600 is still capped at 60 FPS, as that's the maximum level of performance that particular CPU can deliver in our test. But even if the cap was, say, 70 FPS, that's not ideal if you require a 90 FPS minimum. The 7800X3D, on the other hand, can throughput as much as 130 FPS in this title, so although we're only seeing 76 FPS with the Ultra preset, it can certainly go faster. You just have to reduce the GPU load, either by lowering the visual quality settings or by enabling upscaling. Now, where the CPUs don't matter at 4K fallacy falls flat on its face is free sports titles, and while I'm aware this claim mostly comes from single-player gamers who play at relatively low frame rates, I guess it's good to be aware that CPU reviews aren't aimed squarely at your specific use case. Take Counter-Strike 2 for example. For this game, 150 FPS, it's not really a lot. In fact, many serious gamers will tell you that it's not nearly enough, with most CS2 players aiming to keep frame rates above 300 FPS. They also prefer to use medium to low quality settings, as this not only helps boost frame rates, but it can also make it easier to spot enemy players. Using the 7700 XT at 1080p, we see that the Ryzen 5 3600 caps out at around 180 FPS in our test, so certainly still playable, but not ideal for competitive gameplay. The 7800 X3D on the other hand starts at around 200 FPS, but can go to almost 500 FPS with a 7700 XT. So once again, this data really tells us everything we need to know. If you require over 200 FPS, the Ryzen 5 3600 won't deliver that level of performance, regardless of the resolution used. Now at 1440p, the very high and high quality settings for the 7800 X3D are much more GPU limited, and of course performance for the 3600 is much the same. Then finally at the 4K resolution we find more of the same. Essentially the frame rates with the 3600 are much the same at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, as that data is all heavily CPU limited. With the 7800 X3D, we do find the limits of the 7700 XT, even when using the low and medium presets. Meanwhile, the 7900 XT data is much the same really. Again, despite using a faster GPU, the 3600 still limits performance at best to 179 FPS, whereas the 7900 XT can go much faster than that. At 1440p, we start to find the real limits of the 7900 XT using the very high and high quality presets, though once again, the data is CPU limited using the medium and low settings. Then at 4K, we find comparable performance between the two CPUs used for testing, but with medium, we see that the 7800 X3D is still 119% faster. Now please note that the RTX 4090 data is much the same, so I'm going to skip it and wrap this up. I did test a few more games such as Helldivers 2, Star Wars Jedi Survivor and ACC, but the results were all very similar to what I've already shown you, so I didn't want to go over more data just repeating what we've already learned. But I'll make those graphs available to Floatplane and Patreon members, but again, you're not really missing out on anything. Now, I can already envision comments claiming that the data here is misleading because the Ryzen 5 3600 is so much slower than the 7800 X3D. And, well, if that's how you feel, I'm sorry to say it, but you've missed the point of this content. Yeah, I did use an extreme example to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make, but the point is, it's the frame rate that's important, not the resolution. Looking at heavily CPU limited 4K results that are often showing you sub 60 FPS frame rates, they aren't useful for gauging CPU performance, especially if you demand more than 60 FPS and are willing to adjust quality settings in an effort to achieve your desired frame rate. Moreover, most gamers are now enabling upscaling at 4K, and really you should, as FSR and DLSS work best at 4K, often having no noticeable impact on visual quality while dramatically boosting performance. That is, of course, if you have a CPU that can drive more frames. As an example, here's the medium quality Starfield data that we just looked at using the 7900 XT. The 3600 was good for 60 FPS, and the 7800 X3D just 64 FPS, so very similar performance there. But if we enable upscaling using the quality mode, performance goes unchanged for the 3600, while the 7800 X3D configuration enjoys an almost 30% performance boost, and now we're gaming at over 80 FPS on average. Now, the most common argument I hear for why 4K data should be included in CPU reviews is because you game at 4K, and therefore you just want to know how much difference there is at that resolution. But that is a bit like asking, how long's a piece of string? Because we're testing with an RTX 4090 at 4K, probably using a high or ultra settings, so that doesn't exactly tell you the full story, as I just showed through a series of benchmark graphs. There are so many unknown variables, or variables that are likely to change, and really, you're just asking the wrong question. The question you should be asking is how many frames can I get at 4K? And to answer that, you need to know the peak performance of the CPU. For me, as a reviewer, testing an RTX 4090 at 4K using the standard presets that we typically use for testing, so that's likely the high or ultra, doesn't really tell the viewer anything useful, and in fact, it's likely going to mislead them. And this is because I would be assuming whatever the resulting performance is, that's what you're going to be happy with, even if it ends up being less than 60 FPS. But in reality, you're going to enable upscaling or turn down quality settings, perhaps both of those things, to boost the frame rate. And when you do, you need to know if the CPU is capable of delivering that level of performance. Though on that note, please note reviews aren't designed to tell you exactly how many frames you'll get in a given title. It's a ballpark figure. We're only testing a small section of a given game, but the performance relative to the other products featured in the comparison should scale fairly consistently. So it does give you a very good idea of how much better one product will perform when compared to another. Also, as another side note, reviewers don't test at low resolutions to make you feel bad about your current CPU and or entice you into upgrading. We test at low resolutions to clearly show you the real performance differences between CPUs so you can make an informed purchase. As for upgrading, it's entirely on you to work out if you need to upgrade. Are you happy with your current level of performance? And if not, are you CPU limited? This is very easy to determine by lowering your resolution or quality settings to see if GPU performance increases. If not, you're most likely CPU limited. Finally, had I used the Ryzen 5 7600, the margin to the 7800X 3D would have been a lot smaller, and in many instances at 4K there would be no difference between those two CPUs. And of course, there's going to be a lot less of a margin at 1080p as well. You'd really only buy a 7800X 3D over something like a 7600 or 7700 series product because you just want the best of the best, either because you can comfortably afford it or because you really do need maximum performance. But in any case, when comparing CPUs, it is important to know the true performance because although you might not be able to unlock that performance now, the extra performance could certainly come in handy for future GPU upgrades. Though I'm not suggesting going and spending more than you've budgeted for on your CPU, especially when parts like the Ryzen 7 7700 are perfectly adequate. It's just good to have all the right information so you can make an informed purchase. And that is going to do it for this video. Hopefully you found this testing, this slightly different testing, interesting. I certainly did. That's stuff we've done in the past, but it's always good to have a fresh look at it. Also, we have Float Plan and Patreon. Take a fresh look at either of those. You will get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams we do for members, and we chat about whatever's going on and answer your questions live. There's behind the scenes content and Q&A stuff, so check that out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.